Bruchim habaim ledikduk dakot. This grammar video is on an introduction to imperfects and a little bit about the imperative at the end, just for fun. Let's review what a Hebrew verb is composed of. All Hebrew verbs are made from a 3-consonant root. So all Hebrew verbs have 3 root letters that form the basis or the foundation of the verb. And also those 3 root letters communicate the basic meaning of the verb. They also, verbs in general in Hebrew describe action and also describe states of being. So an action like walking or running or drinking, a state of being like being afraid or being full, something like that. Everything else that the verb communicates, all the other meaning, the subject of the verb, the relationship between the action and time, all of those other things are communicated by consonants and vowels that get attached to or added onto that basic 3-letter root. And we're going to talk about one of those things that gets attached right now. So the imperfect form is created by taking the independent personal pronoun, the IPP, which we have written here in these 2 columns, taking the IPP and contracting it and attaching it to the beginning of that 3-letter root. So you'll recall that this also is how the perfect form is made. You take the IPP, you make a contracted form of it, and you attach it to the end of the 3-letter root. Well, the prefixes that get attached to the beginning are a slightly different contracted form of that same IPP. You'll learn in a future video that this also happens with suffixes. Take the IPP and contract it in yet a different way and attach that at the end. So the IPPs are all over in the Hebrew language, particularly in the verbal system. So in the imperfect, you take the IPP, you contract it, and you add it to the beginning of a 3-letter root. When you do that, well, it's quite simple if you think about it conceptually. If the IPP attaches to the beginning of the root, it's indicating that action is beginning or has just begun. So in English, we would translate that as either present or future tense. But remember, Hebrew is not a tense-based language. This is talking about whether action has been completed or not. The perfect is the difference. If you attach the IPP to the end, that suggests that action has ended. It's really that simple. Action is beginning, the IPP is on the beginning. It's prefixed. Action has ended, you affix the affix to the end. We translate imperfects using present or future forms. That's the round peg into the square hole adjustment that we need to make. Okay, so let's walk through this paradigm here that you can see. This is just another version of the same paradigm in the textbook. I'll identify some of the patterns that are there. So the third-person masculine forms both begin with yod. The difference between them is that the plural has a prefix complement. That's one thing I didn't mention earlier. Some prefixes have a prefix complement, which is something at the end. You'll see a number of them here. Something at the end that differentiates the prefix for gender and number. Because a number of the prefixes are the exact same. For instance, all second-person prefixes are tavs. You can see the relationship between the IPP that has a tav here and the prefix with a tav. The difference between them, how you can tell between both gender and number, is the prefix complement, is what differentiates. So the second masculine singular is a tav with nothing on the end. The plural is a tav with a shurik vav, the u. Same with the third person. Yod, yod with a u on the end. You'll notice that both third and second feminine plural prefix forms are exactly the same. Context will determine whether it's y'all female or them female. You can see the aleph from ani and the aleph prefix, the noon from anananachnu, and the noon prefix right there. All feminine prefixes begin with tav. That's helpful and something to keep in mind. And again, all second person prefixes begin with tav. Now let's take the example of yichtov. Yichtov is the imperfect, third masculine singular imperfect of the root kaf, tav, beit, which means to write. So this we would translate either as he writes or he will write. We'll just take that through the whole chart just to give you an idea of how these translate based on what person, gender, and number it is. So the first one here is would be yichtov, third masculine singular. He writes. He writes. It could be either he writes or he will write. He writes. She writes for third feminine singular. You masculine singular write, or you feminine singular write. And I write. Now we're moving into the plurals, and I'll switch into the future tense, which is the other option. They write, masculine. They write, feminine. Y'all, masculine, write, and y'all, feminine, write, or we write. They will write, you will write, and we will write. It can be either present or future. So there's one other thing to think about here, which is going all the way back several chapters to when we first introduced the imperative. If you look at just the second person forms here, you may notice or recall or feel some sort of familiarity between the prefix complements and the imperative endings that you learned way back when. And if you are making that connection, way to go, because you're a bright student. Making connections is good. The reason that your mind is making those connections, perhaps, is because these are exactly the imperative forms. The imperative in Hebrew is made based off of the imperfect. So what you do is the same, actually it's interesting, it works the same way in English as it does in Hebrew. If you take the sentence, you will write, that would be a translation of the imperfect from Hebrew. You will write. If you take the pronoun off, you, and then also have to take off the future tense modifier in English, you're just left with write. The same works here in Hebrew. If we have the word tov, you will write, if we erase the prefix, which is the equivalent of removing the subject, removing the pronoun, we're left with simply ketov, write. So it goes from you will write to write. And you can see there are 4 different endings here in the second person to differentiate between masculine singular, masculine plural, and feminine plural. The masculine singular has no ending, which is usual. If we take off the prefix here, you're left with you feminine will write. Kitvi, plural. Kitvu, plural masculine. Kitvu, y'all write. And the feminine y'all is ketovna. So this is really the simplest way to think about how the imperative is formed. It's based on the imperfect, remove the prefix, and you're really left with the imperative. Hopefully that's helpful. Lech l'shalom.